Hello, I'm Jon Faine, and welcome to another of our series of Monash Law in Conversation. I'll introduce our guest tonight in just a moment. But first, we want to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also express my personal impatience for a treaty or treaties to try and address just some of the mistakes of our colonial past, without which it's my firm personal view that we're a bit stuck. Tonight, we have the absolute pleasure of welcoming Amanda McKenzie, who's one of the founders of and now CEO of the Climate Council. And there are a few issues that are as pressing in our world than this one. She's been at the forefront of all the public policy debates and activism, but now locking horns with government and philanthropists and right across the sector of education, business, you name it. She's right there in the thick of things on the most important and pressing issue of our time. So, Amanda, wonderful to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
How does a law degree prepare you for climate activism or running a major influencing organisation like the Climate Council?
I think back to my studies and just the amount of content that you had to get across. And I was doing it relatively quickly because I was often cramming at the end of the semester.
We'll come to why in a moment.
But I feel like that getting across a huge range of issues across the subject matter, the various cases, etc., and then synthesizing it to the point that you can be very efficient in an exam to get all of that content across, you become very expert at communicating. And I think that's what I've then taken into my role. And when I got involved in climate change after a few years, the big gap I saw was in climate communications. And over my career, I've had to synthesize so much information. And I remember working with scientists, for instance, on something like heat waves. And there was a myriad of scientific caveats and various ways to say it. And I got it down to with the scientists, so you're saying it's hotter, longer, and more often. That's what we're getting to with heat waves. It's like, yes, okay, that's what we're talking about with heat waves. That phrase, the measure of success with communications is who is saying that phrase, and now it's one of the common phrases on heat waves. It's longer, it's hotter.
Repeating it back to you.
Yeah, exactly, from journalists or from politicians or whoever. And so I take that back to that work in law school of taking on a new challenge, whether it's tort or contract, having to get across all of this information, synthesize it, and find a way to communicate it really efficiently.
So were you ever in doubt about what you do with your law degree? Did you ever think you might go into practice instead of turning into this kind of superhero activist?
I had imagined when I started my law degree that I might be, I'd be doing some sort of human rights related law work. I was very passionate about asylum seekers and refugees. And in my first year of law, one of the things I did was volunteer at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. And that was the very early days of the ASRC when I was doing supporting clients with their humanitarian visa applications and making claims right at the end of processes that they'd gone through. And so I felt very passionate about that and thought, maybe that's where I would go. It wasn't until later in my degree that I kind of got involved in climate, and then that became my mission, if you like.
So did you ever think about practicing?
I did, and the big decision for me was when I was leaving, when I graduated, I did honours, and I did that in looking at emissions trading at that time. But I had done articles with a law firm in Melbourne, and I was all set up at Middleton's, and they were great, and I was all set up to go in and do my articles as it was then. But then I had started the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. It was taking off, had enough money to employ me to run it. So I deferred the offer. My mum kept saying, come on, take that, do a few years in practice and then come back and do the activism piece. But I just felt like I had to follow my calling at that point. But the work that I did through the law school as well, I think, in terms of managing an organisation, having the confidence to have conversations about a wide variety of topics particularly when you're talking about what's the constitution of the organisation, or are we going to work in this way or that way. I also feel like the law degree gave me a degree of confidence to be working across complexity and with language that might be a little bit intimidating if you hadn't come across it before. I think those sorts of things are very useful when you're then in business and when you're looking at legislation, for instance, when you're in advocacy. So there's lots of different ways that I think the law degree was useful.
So to distill a law degree, it's about challenging power, and it's about learning how to hold authority to account and where power comes from. And that's not a pun on power as in renewable energy. So in what way, I mean, all of those skills come into play, but part of what you do is you challenge science. Scientists don't necessarily like lawyers trying to unpick what they do.
That's true. I've been lucky to work with scientists who are, we've got a lot of synergy in the objectives that we're seeking. So Professor Will Steffen is one of the foremost climate scientists in the world, and he was one of the first in the Climate Council. We worked very closely on some of those things like the heatwave report, some of the bushfire work, etc. Because a decade ago, scientists, in the way they talked about climate change, were often very unclear. It would sound like this is very much a future issue, or there was a range of caveats. For instance, in the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they use a word likely, which means 66% chance that it will happen. So for most people, that means it's probably going to happen. But the word likely was used as a caveat that often people would interpret to be less than 50%, or may happen, may not, but we don't need to worry about it. Whereas when they were getting to the sort of 60%, they were meaning we're reasonably sure it's going to happen. So there was kind of unpacking what some of those words actually meant to a lay audience rather than the scientific audience, which is very well schooled in it, but the scientists not feeling necessarily comfortable to use the same language with then a lay audience because they might be criticised by their colleagues. So it was really trying to empathise, and I think this is somewhat like an interaction with a client around a case or something like that, where you're really trying to get underneath what is going on for scientists in how they're trying to communicate, where is it being done poorly, how are we trying to be more and more clear. So very simple things like scientists would often lead with the caveats and then get to the main point. So it might be in a range of different scenarios, this might happen or this might happen, but heat waves are getting hotter, longer and more often. Well, let's just reverse that around. Let's just let's not bury the message here. Let's put it at the top, get that through, and then we can qualify it in a range of different ways if we need to.
So that journalists call that don't bury the lead.
Yes.
Yeah. And likewise, though, the caveats, lawyers talk in caveats. I mean, that's what caveats are, legal terms. So, lawyers qualify everything they say, and to learn not to do that is to go against your training. So is that instinct for you? Or was there a mentor? Was there someone who you went, that's how I want to be?
I think that before the Climate Council, I worked at the Climate Commission, which was the public body that was then abolished before we created the Climate Council. Which is
how was it abolished?
So the Climate Commission was established to provide accurate information to the Australian public under the Gillard government. Tony Abbott came in.
Who?
You remember that guy, Tony Abbott, a few years ago, and abolished the Climate Commission as a first act of government.
Yeah, because there were no issues that needed to be.
We didn't need to learn about it anymore.
No.
And that one of the things that really was terrible was that public website that had been worked on for 3 years. All of these resources were just taken down straight away so that it couldn't be accessed. So fortunately, we downloaded them in advance, and we had a sense that this might happen. We didn't know how it would happen, but that's when we were able to run a crowdfunding campaign to start the Climate Council off the back of that abolition. It's like the phoenix rising from the ashes.
Yeah, to defy their political will.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and with hindsight, we can see just how absurd that position was. But at the time, it was popular enough to get them elected, wasn't it, along with other things?
Yeah, well, it was probably the quickest way that they could indicate, hey, we are going to really try and destroy everything that's been done by the previous government on climate change. It was sort of the first scalp. Then they went through with the carbon pricing scheme and a range of other things, but that was the first step.
I mean, we had Twiggy Forrest and Jenna Reinhardt and other people on the back of a flatbed truck complaining about, dare we say it, taxing mining.
Yeah.
And you look back and now Twiggy's turned into this kind of evangelistic renewable energy figure, and you go, whoa, that's a bit of a shift.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been a lot of that. The end of the climate wars, so-called. There's a lot of people that have forgotten the side that they were previously on. And
well, is it that, or they've just been a bit late, but the scales have been lifted and they've suddenly seen what's arguably happening, which before they were arguing about, and now they're not.
And that's fantastic. We'll welcome anyone to the side of the truth. And Twiggy Forrest, I think, is a good example of someone who has, had his moment of actually understanding the science and what needs to be done. I think that there is still, in certain media outlets, for instance, the maybe talking the talk, but still when it comes to something like energy prices, why is energy prices going up? Oh, let's blame renewables again, even though that's totally false. So there's still some of those old messages that were so prominent in the climate wars in preventing action and coming through again and again as we move forward. And it can be just attacking Labor for the sake of attacking Labor because they're the ones bringing the policies.
Let's wander back to law school for a little bit longer and linger there, but we'll come back to some of the issues you deal with day to day and some of the cutting edge challenges that you now have to face. But back to law school, were there things you wish you'd been taught and you weren't?
Oh, that's a good question. I think what I wish I'd been taught is more of the variety of pathways that someone could take on. I think there was this, a lot of the dialogue, particularly amongst the students, was which is the commercial law firm that I want to get into, which is the best, and then how do I get to be partner by the time I'm 30? And that was very, I got a bit caught up in that because I can be quite achievement orientated, which is what...
No, go on.
What a lot of law students can be like, right? But I did enjoy spending a lot of time at the Whole Foods Cafe with a whole lot of other law students who were doing things like I was doing, volunteering at that ASRC or on environmental cases or a whole variety of things. And there I felt like I was in a different environment of thinking about what are the other possibilities and that's not the only pathway for a law grad that's meaningful.
So you're, as much as anything, you're a diplomat now.
I suppose that's true.
Were you taught anything about diplomacy?
I don't remember being taught about diplomacy.
Okay, you're a lobbyist. Were you taught anything about lobbying?
No.
You're an activist. You acquired that from your student coterie, you're telling us, but it's not part of the course.
Well, all of those things were in an arts degree. I think that's often, as we get more orientated around the professions, forget that arts degrees give so much of a variety. Like in my arts degree, for instance, we were in an international relations course, and the lecturer decided to do an exercise where we were all going to be different countries. And there was going to be scenarios put forward every week. And I was China for one class, and then I was PNG for the other class. And remember creating the Port Moresby Accords for the various things. And that incorporated a range of the skills that I suppose I've used in activism. But my law degree, I think, was much more orientated. You've got to get all of this content in your mind, and then you've got to get it all out through the exam.
One of the things you do now, excuse me, is you work with lawyers, particularly talking about things like legislation. What do you think when you deal with scientists, you deal with politicians, you deal with a whole lot of different professions? What about when you deal with the lawyers? What do you think?
A lot of the lawyers I deal with are lawyers that are working on cases where they're trying to frustrate certain projects for gas companies or coal companies. They might be working for traditional owners. They might be working for as defending certain species, etc. So people that are using the law, as you said, to challenge power, and and there's a range of different really interesting cases now. So the lawyers that I work with in that space, I think I find a lot of synergy with them because they're very strategic. What is our goal here? What are we trying to do? And how do we use the law as a tool to help us get to that goal? But
in isolation, or as one of a suite of tools?
Well, it used to be one of the suite of tools, and it is in certain organisations like the Australian Conservation Foundation, for instance. But there are now specialist outfits like the Environmental Defenders Office, but also Environment Justice Australia and a few others. There's a bit of a proliferation of outfits that are working on this and allowing...
in some ways, they actually bump into each other, don't they? needs to be tidied up a bit.
Perhaps, but I'm of the view that, we've got this David and Goliath battle. Even if Davids are bumping into each other a little bit, it's probably better to have a few more of them.
Okay. Politicians. What do you make of that sphere? You're bumping heads, not banging heads with politicians pretty much every day, and you have been for all of your action-packed career. What do you make of the setup that we've got? Do you think it's working? Do you think the system is delivering the sorts of results that we need? A lot of people, we've rarely had a time where people have been as disillusioned as they are now. I don't know of one.
Yeah. There's a question around what is the reform that you would make to the system that would make it better, and what is the time frame? And because I'm focused on climate, the time frame is so short that I don't focus much on what are the reforms to our democratic process, other than where it is enabling the climate action to happen more quickly. Because I'm talking about we need to do the lion's share of the effort this decade. So some of that dovetails together and some of it doesn't. So I suppose what I'm saying is I don't work on the kind of level of systemic reform other than things like where you can use the current system. So the TEALs, for instance, if we think that the system is somewhat fit for purpose, but the way that the political parties have gamed it to be, whether it's on political financing for political parties or how they've shut out others, well, there was still a lot of opportunity for the TEALs in the right environment. And I think that they have done an amazing job to get elected, and then doing some things that are challenging the way our parliament is operating, like through the Integrity Commission, for instance.
Sure, but is our view of the success of TEALs somewhat altered by the revelation just recently that they amassed a war chest of $2 million? And it wasn't just the groundswell of support, the army of volunteers, but it was a massive bankroll that led to that success. Doesn't that kind of change the dynamic?
To an extent, except it wouldn't have been possible without money. You just can't get anyone elected in any country in the world probably without money, and we're lucky that it's not as bad as the United States. But in the Australian context, it's sort of that the necessary evil, if you like. I think they wouldn't have been elected on the current rules. They couldn't have got elected if they didn't have the money, and the rules allow them to have, raise that money, and then you hope that they are principled enough and have that integrity to go and argue. Many of the TEALs have platforms around that financing piece to make it more of an equal playing field,
which may undo their own success.
That's right. I think the benefit of having people run for politics who are independent and have previous careers is that then they could go back to other careers. They're not as, these political warriors that are going to be there forever and they have no other options.
Or have come up as, student politicians working for a minister, serving a term in the ministerial suite, and then bang.
Yeah, and then they're holding on to the seat with, their tooth and nail, right? Whereas I'd imagine that the TEALs will be passionate about getting re-elected, but it may not be that they don't have no other options if they're...
Sure. But the fairy tale of this was just some kind of groundswell of necessity, driven by necessity, it is a bit tempered by that, isn't it? That there are some very strategic, sophisticated, well-heeled backers enabling it. I get your point that you can't do it without money, but it dilutes the message a bit.
Yeah, perhaps dilutes the message, but they wouldn't have got elected if they hadn't had the volunteers, and they wouldn't have got elected if they hadn't had that community input of donations. The philanthropy was important as well, but none of those pieces could have happened without the other. So I think that I think we've got to listen also to the fact that there was so many of the community, and hopefully, I'd argue that if we can take money out of politics to a greater degree, that is a good thing. But if there's anyone that's starting from totally the ground up, starting new political parties, it is very challenging to do. There has to be reality is there has to be some money involved.
So how do you go dealing with people who are complete climate deniers. How do you go in a meeting with, a Matt Canavan or someone like that?
We don't meet with Matt Canavan.
Why not?
There's no utility to it. So for many years now, my view is that you basically just ignore deniers, that there is no point, because if people have seen the information, as someone like Matt Canavan has had all the opportunity in the world to see the best information and be briefed by the best people, and he is philosophically opposed to absorbing that information, he's not for changing. I'm much better spending my time talking to the people who are perhaps in the middle, that perhaps get that this is a bit of a problem, but don't know it's a problem. Is it a problem for today or is it a problem tomorrow? And getting those people to be more and more passionate. So think of it as a bit of a spectrum, if you like. You have the people that are right on board versus the people who are the climate deniers. What I'm trying to do is move those people in the middle to be more and more concerned over time, more and more concerned and active, and isolate the deniers. And that's effectively what's happened in the last few years. It's you're seen as pretty crazy for the most part if you've got a view that climate change isn't happening. Even someone like Matt Canavan will say, oh yeah, climate change is happening.
But it's not human-made, or there's no point Australia doing anything.
Yeah, and obviously we need more coal and gas, and coal and gas can be, you can make it without all the emissions, because you can just have some CCS and these other things.
Or science will come up with something. We shouldn't change what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's quite a strategic, that's a transactional view of politics then, isn't it? Which is that it's not about lofty idealism. It's actually about outcomes and getting results.
Yes.
And you're not apologetic at all about that, which personally I find quite refreshing, because it's the old Franklin Delano Roosevelt thing. I did what I could with what I had at the time. It's not about saying, well, this is what we wish we could do, but we can't do it, so we won't.
Yeah, exactly. I think you need a whole lot of pragmatism about an issue like this when you have a drop-dead deadline, in a way. It might be a bit a strong language, but we've been saying, scientists have been telling us for years, we have to do it, it's urgent, it's urgent, it's urgent. Now we're at the point where we're likely to get to 1.5 degrees of warming this decade. At the end of the decade, we've already seen a degree of warming, and that is this catastrophe in Australia of the black summer fires, the repeated flooding in many locations. And you just think about the last 3 years, more than 80% of people have experienced some climate-fueled disaster in Australia in some way. Like, that's huge numbers, let alone thinking about people in Pakistan that have much less resources that are dealing with these repeated floods. So it's absolutely here now. It will get worse before it gets better. And the head of the UN was just saying, we're on our way to climate hell. So the era for pragmatism, as you said, what can we get done now? What is the next step and the next step and the next step? And we can't bring everyone with us.
Do you get angry?
I do sometimes. I think I do get very frustrated, and I sometimes just get really sad. I think the moments that I get sad are sometimes with my children, when I have it's one of those idyllic afternoons where you're in the playground and they're both getting along really well, and you're pushing them on swings and it's beautiful lighting. And I just get this feeling of, this isn't forever, that this is, what does our future look like? And I try and just stay present in the moment rather than thinking about the future. But that's where I feel like that comes up to me. What is it going to be like for them when they have little children? And
Amanda's a grandmother.
Yeah, that's right. Because my daughter, she's born in 2018. My son's 2021. So they'll be, my age in the 2050s. And at that point, the debate about when was net zero the right time is well gone by the time that they're at sort of this stage of their career.
Sure, but you've been thinking about these issues long before you even contemplated becoming a parent. So although that may galvanise your emotions now, you've been through some periods, and we've just come out of 9 years of a coalition government that squandered opportunities to do things in a whole range of portfolios, which is not what we're here to talk about tonight, but gee, it's tempting. So you'd have every reason in your particular field to be filled with despair, but there's not much sign of Amanda becoming a despair peddler.
Yeah, I remember when I was working on asylum seekers, talking to a lawyer who'd been working on it for a long time and said the same question: how do you not feel despairing? There's people that have legitimate claims and they maybe haven't been able to voice it properly, and it just seems like there's this endless deluge of people coming from around the world. And said to me, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is to give up. And I think about that on the climate perspective, is like, if you give up, what would be the consequence? And to my mind, every fraction of a degree that we can prevent in terms of warming, that's species saved, that's people that don't experience the level of disasters that they could have experienced. It's communities that we save. It's protecting the majesty of this amazing planet that we live on. So that is what motivates me, that even if I don't think there's a binary of we can save the world or we can't save the world. I think that's often the way we think about it. Can we save the planet or not? But it's, what are we protecting and how much can we protect?
It's almost a missionary zeal, isn't it?
Yes, that's what my mum says to me.
Is it?
Yeah.
She's very obviously a very wise woman. So do you have a religious background?
I don't. But I felt from a young age a very strong sense of obligation to contribute positively. I think it, from a very early age, I think when I was 4, I had this very strong memory of being aware that I would die and being petrified of that. I don't know why. I was so young and had this sort of realization.
Did you see Bambi or something?
Maybe. I can't remember. My parents can't remember, but I remembered I talked to my dad a lot through my childhood about this, and he's a bit of a philosopher, and kind of came to the view that the best life is one with a degree of meaning. And we're not religious, and he's a strong atheist. And so I think I was struggling to find what is a sense of meaning without religion. But I found that if I can contribute positively to the world, that would give me a sense of meaning. So in my teenage years, I was really searching for what would be my thing to work on. And I worked on a plethora of different human rights issues and environmental issues. And then when I found climate, it just struck me that it cut across every other issue. And if we didn't sort this out, that human suffering would just be immeasurably increased. So that's what kind of motivated me.
But you're not exactly the girly SWAT type either, are you? You didn't retreat into the library and sit there surrounded by learned tomes in order to absorb all the information and forego parties. And
I did do a bit of that. I did do a bit of that. Yeah, I read a lot when I knew about climate change, but I read Tim Flannery's book, The Weather Makers, in 2005, and it was a bit of a aha moment, and I felt like I really needed to get across it in a lot more detail. And it wasn't as if I had this moment where I was like, this is my life's mission at that point. It just, I thought, I'll work on this for a while, and surely once everyone realizes how serious it is, we will act. Because if everyone read Tim Flannery's book in 2005, surely we would act. And then got over in the next few years to understand politics and how challenging it is to have to create social change and technological change over time.
It's ingrained, a lot of what you're trying to change is ingrained in our culture.
Yes.
And not just our culture, but in particular culture of rich societies, first world cultures. So the magnitude of the task can't really be underestimated.
That's right. And I do think about that in terms of the phases of communication, because there's a phase of communication we've been in, which is just to show the benefits of the solution. So of renewable energy, we can do it differently. We don't have to be burning coal. Here is the renewables. Electric vehicles, you don't have to have a petrol car. You can have an electric car. But the reality is, if we reduce our emissions 75% and then go to zero very quickly thereafter, we can't have the same number of cars on the road as we do now. We'll probably have half the number of cars, and we have to do better at public transport, active transport, e-bikes, sharing cars, an electric Uber. All of those things would need to happen. So it's not that we're going to live in the same way. We're going to have to live in a different way. And that's one of the challenges for me in thinking through what are the next phases of communications. You do the first bit, which is just the change is desirable. And then actually the change is bigger than and is disruptive, is the sort of next phase of the communications. And how do you bring along the community to the level of disruption that's required to get to net zero extremely quickly, because we're very late.
Yeah, it's about urban planning. It's about a whole lot of things. And then you get a war in Ukraine and we're going backwards with emissions. And doesn't that make you kind of feel, well, I mean, for all the changes we've made, one geopolitical crisis like that sets us back a decade.
I think the advantage of having worked in the climate space for 17 odd years is that you see this pattern of moving forward and moving back and moving forward and moving back.
Progress is not linear. It doesn't just move along a line.
And the thing that I find very useful, so I don't get despairing at these sorts of moments where Ukraine happens, is to look backwards at the level of change that's occurred. So when I started working on climate, there were a few thousand homes with solar panels. Now it's like over 2.5 million homes, and that's happened in a short period of time. And no one estimated that would happen. No one could see that change was happening. They couldn't see that the cost curve would plummet.
And it was nothing to do with government.
No. Well, some governments, European governments, had an influence.
But
in
Australia, it was, they didn't help.
Yeah, the federal government was very unhelpful in many ways. So I think that's useful when you see these things. It's like the Ukraine crisis isn't quite a blip. It's going to be bigger than a blip for the climate and emissions story. But it is pushing a range of countries in Europe to say, well, we were using a lot of Russian gas. What do we need to do differently? And some of them will make poor decisions and some of them are making better decisions where they're pushing renewable energy faster.
Even in a European winter, though, they're going to be scrambling around for how to maintain some form of acceptable standard of living through this winter.
Yeah, and I think you asked me before whether I get angry. And I think I sometimes get angry, but in a way, I think it's important to be somewhat emotionally distanced from what is happening so you can maintain that degree of pragmatism. So for me, when the Ukraine crisis happens and we're seeing the impact on the climate story, I can't let myself be sort of knocked off course by something like that. I think it's just like, okay, this is another step backwards. How do we pivot? How do we pivot? That's my message to our staff a lot of the time is just, we know the world is changing so quickly and we just don't know what's going to be around the next corner and the next corner. So let's just optimize where we are, as we were saying earlier. What's the next foot forward and the next foot forward?
And how do we get there? Amanda McKenzie, CEO and one of the founders of the Climate Council, is our guest in Monash Law in Conversations this week. And you can online send us questions and you can use the usual sort of gadgets down the bottom of your screen and send questions that I can include in the conversation. And there's a few coming through on the screen and I'll get to them eventually. I saw an ad this week, I think it was in The Economist, for the first all-electric Rolls-Royce. And it's so opulent. It's so over the top. It's so obviously a vanity project for people who are in the market for a Rolls-Royce but want to signify to the entire world, oh my goodness, I've gone for the electric version. And I kind of thought, isn't that like, it's almost like it's undoing itself. This is, on the one hand, recognizing the need for sustainability, and on the other hand, undermining it by putting a product like that out in the marketplace. What do you make of it?
Yeah. The advantage with the electric luxury vehicles has been that it's created a sense of desirability around these vehicles. And no one's done it better than Tesla, I don't think, because their design is so beautiful.
You need to declare your...
Oh, yeah, I do. My husband does work at Tesla, so I should say that. But and I do have a Tesla, which I love.
Ethics is part of a law degree, yeah.
But even before he worked at Tesla, I think the design, it's a little bit like... I think going from the Nokia phone to the iPhone in that. And I think, so I think creating that sense of desirability and aspiration, I think has been useful in shifting people's perception of electric vehicles as being something that
niche
and a bit greeny. And I don't know if you remember the solar cars that have panels on the roof, but it only fits one person and only goes a certain distance, and just felt like, oh, it's too futuristic and it's never going to happen. So I think that's been useful, but I think what you're saying is absolutely right, that there's also the cultural element of we just can't consume at the levels that we're currently consuming. It's untenable from a climate perspective, but also from a whole range of different ways. And we can't have a culture that's as throwaway as it is now, whether it's from a plastic perspective or fast fashion or all of these other elements. And the rich world needs to be the one that changes, because the rest of the world, for obvious reasons, is saying, well, I'd like all that nice stuff as well, and that like easy way of living. So how do we create a scenario where we have a much more realistic sense of what is acceptable to consume for any individual person in the world, that's much more equitable, but also is more sustainable?
But it does raise the whole conversation that we need to have about governments can do this much, consumers can do this much, but where's business in all of this? Now, there's a lot of business organisations that are jumping on. There are some that are doing it for sincere reasons, some are doing it for cynical reasons, some do it to greenwash their reputation. They do horrible things and then they put a veneer of respectability over it, or sustainability, whatever, to try and trick people. So what's the obligation on business, and how do you advance that and monitor it?
Yeah, one of the key realizations that I've had in the last sort of decade was that the federal government in our country, but probably in most countries, won't be the actor that leads. The leadership comes from subnational governments, from states, from local governments that's more connected and close to their community. It comes from a range of different businesses and innovators. It comes from the community. And once there's enough of it and there's enough agitation, generally a larger level of government, the national government, will take it the next step. But unless it's very hard, and it's not just because a cynical view of the federal government, it's also how would a government lead and then maintain that? So we saw with Tony Abbott, taking everything back that the previous government had then created some leadership on. So I think business has an absolutely critical role in creating innovation and leading, using the policy environment where it's been positive to do that work. But obviously, as you said, there's many businesses and some of the very large companies in Australia that have been huge problems, and Santos is one that's sort of out in front at the moment, being heavily criticised for wanting to open a whole range of new gas projects and trying to greenwash. Gas is fine. It's a transition fuel.
Less bad,
when it's not less bad. It's the gas, the process of taking gas out of the ground, transporting it, all uses fossil fuels. There's a huge amount of emissions that goes in what's called fugitive emissions from the actual mining, where methane is released. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas. And then when you're burning it, you're burning a fossil fuel. So the idea that you keep burning fossil fuels to make the problem better is just crazy. It might have been a transition fuel at some stage, maybe 20 years ago, but it's not now. The transition fuels is the sun and the wind. And
so we should stop investing money in what's not a stopgap, but actually is a false god.
Absolutely.
And go straight to, even if it's a bit disruptive.
Well, it's actually AEMO, the energy market operator, says we don't need any more gas to do the transition to 100% renewables.
And it's phenomenally expensive suddenly because of
hugely
Ukraine
expensive.
And Russia. Yeah.
So it's expensive, it's polluting, it's terrible for our health. One of the things that many people don't realise, we use gas burners in our house, but when we burn it, there are fumes that go into the house and they can contribute to childhood asthma and a range of other health concerns. We have it right in our house. I feel like in 100 years, we'll look back at that and be like, oh, you use that in your house? Why wouldn't you use an induction cooktop? Obviously. It's one of those things that I think people will look back on and think, oh.
Yeah.
The same way we look at like kerosene lights.
We're just talking about a kitchen renovation. You've just put my head into a spin. So, but government has a role in creating the settings.
Yes.
That businesses work according to a pretty straightforward formula. Mm-hmm. What's going to make a buck?
Yeah.
So you can use taxation and you can use penalties and you can use incentives to kind of flip the equation, can't you? And they've got obligations to their shareholders and all the rest of it. They've got legal obligations, fiduciary obligations. So you've got to kind of play around with the levers to drag them faster to where they're otherwise inevitably going to go.
Absolutely. And a good example of that is vehicle emissions standards. Mm-hmm. So Australia has standards for our vehicles, and we've got much worse standards that the US, China, European Union. So we become a dumping ground for these polluting vehicles. We get some of the, and we already are. We've got some of the worst polluting vehicles in the world, and it's because we don't have appropriate standards. So the vehicle manufacturers, when they're looking at, and many of them are, they're all multinational companies. Where do we place our stock? They're not going to place their best electric vehicles in Australia. Most of the companies that are not purely electric, like a Tesla or some of the Chinese companies that have only some electric vehicles, they only send a very small number here, which is just a demonstration, basically, whereas most of it's just a dumping ground for their petrol vehicles.
So where does Amanda McKenzie stand on hydrogen as an alternative fuel for vehicles, both commercial and private?
Yeah, hydrogen probably won't be the answer to vehicles. It will probably be batteries, because that's already got the market behind it, and hydrogen technology is so far relatively away. I think hydrogen will play an important role as fuel in a certain range of things. But my main worry with hydrogen is it's become the flavour of the month, and it's a solution that will not make a difference this decade. It's a solution that will probably make a difference in future decades. So it's a very easy one to commit to because it creates very little disruption now. And for the gas companies, they say, oh, we need all of the same infrastructure for gas as we need for hydrogen. But actually, some of that's a bit of greenwashing again. Quite a lot of that is untrue. So I think it's a distraction, the degree of emphasis. We need some emphasis, but we don't need every government in Australia to be pouring all their resources into going down that pathway.
And then there's the people who say, well, hang on, we've now got solar paint. And you can paint a vehicle with solar panels and power the batteries, and it's a power station on wheels.
Yeah.
So innovation is coming so fast, and this is where there's a role for government, surely, in turbocharging some of that innovation. And we sitting here today, we don't know what's going to be announced tomorrow.
Well, that's been one of the critical things for the last decade in Australia, why there was some progress in climate solutions, was that the Gillard government, with the support of the Greens, created the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ARENA, the Renewable Energy Agency. And ARENA does the sort of more early stage renewable and other development, and the CEFC provides finance and is like a bank for clean energy. And both of those institutions survived the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison era, and they've been enormously effective, to the extent that the Morrison government often touted them as being, the great solutions of their government, even though it had been attempted to abolish them at numerous different occasions. So that sort of finance piece has been critical.
Okay, so that's the role of government in particular, rather than trying to second guess the market or tell the market what to do.
Well,
get the settings right, the market will look after itself. Do you believe in the market?
Well, you've got, I think it's one of those things that I think it can work well, but you've got to put the right settings on it and consider the negative externalities. But the role of government, I think, in this space is get the settings right. And then ARENA, there is a degree of picking winners, because you're saying, well, what is the technology investments that we might need to make as a government? So that level of support for research and development is really critical for government as well. So there is a degree of, we're going to invest in these sorts of things through ARENA.
A couple of other things. There's lots of questions coming through, and I need to honour the fact that I asked people to send in questions, so I will get to them in a moment. A couple of things about Amanda first.
Yeah.
You must have been approached to go into politics. Are you tempted?
No.
Why not?
I don't think it's where I'm best placed. I think that
Why not?
I find watching something like Question Time makes my skin crawl. I don't like having that combative, I can do it at times, but I don't want to be in that combative environment all the time. It doesn't suit my personality. And I don't think I'm good at the sort of wheeling and dealing that's required to be getting things done in that political setting that's much more intense than the level of like lobbying and advocacy work. I think where I'm much better placed is to be doing the work that I'm doing in communications, science, advocacy work at a broader level.
And yet politics is misdescribed, because most of the work of politics is not about shouting at your opponents across Question Time for 1 hour every day for a couple of weeks when Parliament's actually sitting. Politics is actually much more nuanced than that, and you've seen it. You've been in those sessions, you've been in meetings and party rooms and negotiations and all of that stuff. So why would that tiny little veneer of aggression at the top, that's really a bit theatrical, and anyone involved in parliamentary politics, state, federal level, knows that that's just a sort of, it's a bit of a show that's put on. The real work is completely different.
Yeah, and the real work, and I think we often, obviously, politicians get a bad rap in Australia, but I think
most of them deserve it.
Many of them do, but I think many politicians that also go in with their heart in the right place to a degree, and it's a really, really hard job to balance all of the different needs and come up with a solution that you think is going to be viable. Yeah, it's just not where I think I'm best placed.
Okay, so instead you're running an organisation of how many staff?
55.
Okay, so that involves a lot of administrivia. That's not your strong suit either.
Yeah, I think some of that I enjoy doing. I like doing the strategy. I like how we structure an organisation to be fit for purpose, to do what our strategy says we think is required. And I like doing some level of management. I think what is challenging is just when you're growing an organisation, how to keep everyone on the same page all the time and going in the same direction. So I'm fortunate we've been able to hire a really good senior team who is able to understand the vision, the strategy, contribute to it in a really deep way, and then work with the organisation to head us in the direction.
Do you want to go on to being on boards? Do you want to go on to kind of sitting at the table at BHP or somewhere and staring someone in the eye and saying, no, we can't do that? That would be disastrous.
I've been on a few boards, particularly not-for-profit boards, and I found that role interesting. And it's useful, again, being involved in that strategic conversation about where this organisation goes and thinking more sort of longer term. So that could be something I do. At the moment, I'm committed to where I am. I've got little kids, and
annoying, aren't they?
So I do my work, I do my little kids, and then that's sort of it. And
well, that's plenty.
Yeah, and is
it harder for women, in particular women of that age, of the urge, wanting to spend time with your kids, and yes, they're annoying, but they're gorgeous too, and wanting to spend, I mean, men feel this too, not just women. I clearly remember it, but wanting to spend more time doing that because it goes so fast.
Yeah,
but you're deeply committed to your job at the same time.
I think if I was working on something else that didn't feel so urgent, maybe I would have taken some more time off or worked more part-time. But I have been able to find a good balance, and it's partly because, I'm a mother running an organisation with young children, and a number of our senior staff are also mothers with young children, that we've structured the organisation very flexibly. So I work in the office, often at home, like 3.5 days a week, but I'll also do work at night, I'll do work in the mornings, I'll do all sorts of different things to just make it work. My kids will come to a lot of different things that I do. I've had kids sitting between my legs at press conferences. I've had kids in lots of different scenarios where, fortunately, I'm reasonably good at keeping them entertained for short periods. When I do media interviews, often on my day with my kids, I'm just like, kids, you're out on the balcony, here's some snacks, closing the door, run away.
Speaking of media, you're a natural, and that's been a key ingredient to your success. What do you advise younger people coming through about dealing with media? Because it can also turn around to bite you.
Oh, yeah. And the strategy I had early on, which was to just take a little bit of care on the topics I talked to. And I was careful to just talk about the stuff I knew about. And because I was conscious, I was 22 and doing late line and things like that at the time. And to try not to embarrass my future self. That's what I felt kind of self-conscious about. Like, if I'm 40 or 50, will I be embarrassed looking back and thinking, well, not embarrassed, more like, will I say something that is not appropriate or beyond my expertise? And I was working with Tim Flannery, who
hates the media, that way. Hates it, just does anything he can to avoid it.
And he had a lot of different gotcha moments. I remember him, the Telegraph did this front page piece with his head photoshopped on a dentist, where he was pulling out someone's tooth because he'd said in a panel on an AMA conference, Australian Medical Association conference, someone had asked him a totally different topic about mercury in amalgam fillings. And he said, oh, well, a $2 pair of pliers can sort out that because crematoriums, it all goes up into the air, but $2 pair of pliers sort it out. And I remember he wouldn't mind me saying that. And of course, that becomes the front page of the Telegraph at a time that it was like really attacking us. So I think I've been doing media before I worked with Tim, but I think that also gave me a sense of I'll just stick to my lane and speak to the things that I know about and sort of broaden that out over time.
So Tim is a mentor. Were there others?
Yeah, I think a mentor that I've worked with the longest is probably Rob Purvis, who's a philanthropist. And I met him in the early days of starting the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. He was one of the first donors. And he was with us, he just backed us the whole way through. He'd have, like in your early 20s, when men approach you to be your mentors and they're, 30 years older than you, there was a real mix of people that were just approaching you because they wanted to hit on you versus ones that were actually genuinely looking to help. And I just remember finding that really challenging in my early 20s and being...
Did people hit on you?
Oh, it was terrible. People would say, oh, I really want to mentor you, come out to dinner. And then you'd be like, oh God, how do I get out of this situation?
Just another sleaze bag.
Yeah. And
do you want to name any of them?
No, but a number of prominent people. But Rob was totally the polar opposite. He was just extremely professional, extremely caring, and much more like, you probably would mind me saying, a bit more like a dad figure to myself and some of the other young women who were starting the Australian Youth Climate Coalition at the time, and really helped us. Like I remember we went to the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009, and we put everything into it that year. We did a big, huge national summit for young people, 1,500 people. We did this Youth Decide, which was a national event for 20,000 events across Australia. And then we took this delegation to the COP. We had 20 Pacific Island young people with us. We stayed at a bikie gang's hostel because we had no money, and we were just there and we had all this stuff. We got home and we were devastated that the COP had resulted. Obama came in, there were no solutions, it was a disaster. And we went home and we were totally devastated, but also we ran out of money. We just spent all the money because we thought this is the time. And then we realized actually it goes on and you have to keep fighting. And I remember going to Rob, I had it in a hand. We spent all the money, we don't have any money. Can you please keep funding us? Because otherwise the organization's going to fold. And he was like, yes, I will keep funding you, but I'm employing an accountant and a financial officer to help you manage your finances better. And we're like, okay, we see the important stuff is actually pretty important. And he helped us with those sort of learnings. He's like, he respected our passion and our enthusiasm.
But you have to respect the budgetary process too.
Yeah.
So some of the questions coming through, where would you say we're up to in terms of the roadmap forward? How far are we along the line?
Well, if we need to get to a 75% reduction this decade of emissions, we're at a curve that is extremely steep. And then to net zero as soon as possible afterwards, basically. It's a steep curve for Australia and it's a very steep curve for the world. And every year that goes by, that curve gets steeper.
So do you think we're halfway through shifting our thinking, or a quarter of the way through? Or
maybe we're a quarter.
A quarter. Okay. And of the different sectors, now I'm busking from the question, agriculture, mining, manufacturing,
electricity.
Who's got it right and who's got
electricity
it wrong?
is a long way in front, but most sectors across the Australian economy, there's 46 of them, have been going up in their emissions. Electricity is, I think, the only one that has gone down. So most sectors, because there's been such a focus on electricity, that's where the action has happened. But at the same time, most of the other sectors, there's been very little action.
Excuse me, agriculture has gone through phenomenal change. And what used to be regarded as a sector that's hostile to climate change is now becoming, in many ways, the custodian of some of the solutions. So do you invest more hope in working with agribusiness?
Absolutely. I think that many of the groups like Meat and Livestock Australia, the National Farmers Federation, have really become quite strong advocates on climate action. They've still got a long way to go, I think it's fair to say. But regenerative agriculture is one of the key things that's going to mitigate the crisis. And, some of these solutions have potential not only to take our emissions down, but also long-term get carbon out of the air as well, which will be really critical if we're going to... The thing that people don't often appreciate is that the temperature rise keeps going up, but it doesn't follow emissions in an exact way. There's a long lag. So the theory is that you can have emissions rise and then get them down before the temperature rise follows. So you have to do that very quickly.
You can interrupt it.
Interrupt it would be the idea, the theory.
Okay, and really important question that inevitably we were going to have to get to, although time is running out, and it's about equality and equity. When thinking about the cultural change that needs to occur, particularly around consumption and social aspirations, is there something to be said about focusing more on creating more equitable society? And when we talk, to add on to the question, not just equitable within our society, but between our society
and others,
and some of our neighbours in particular, who are looking at us and going, what are you doing? We're going underwater here.
Well, the big ethical issue around the climate crisis is those that have contributed the least are being first and worst affected. So the Pacific Islands are a good example. Many in the Pacific, including in the Torres Strait, are experiencing climate impacts, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's inundation of fresh water supplies, it might be accelerating cyclones, other things. So I think the equality piece is extremely important, and the leverage from the developing countries currently at the Conference of the Parties, the big UN summit, is to say, hey, you need to help us, developed world. You created this huge problem and now we're suffering. There needs to be a degree of compensation, but also you need to help us leapfrog some of these fossil fuel mistakes of the past and make sure that we have the capacity to develop in a way that's considerate of the sustainability solutions.
Is it not another example of the complete inadequacy of a United Nations structure that's no longer fit for purpose? Whether we're talking about global conflicts, I mean, Myanmar, obviously Ukraine, I mean, wherever there are problems around the world, and there it is on a geopolitical and military level, but also on climate, it's completely failed as an organisation.
Well, I think the interesting thing about the UN was it failed in Copenhagen in 2009 to come up with a solution, but by the time we got to 2015, Cristina Figueres, who was the leader of the COP, was able to reinvent the way that the COP was orientated. So it was very top down in 2009, and she changed it to a much more bottom up structure for the way the Paris Agreement has come across. So I think that was very interesting to me in terms of, do you reform the system, or where can systems be used? Because we don't have time to reform all the systems, but where can they be made more fit for purpose by the types of personalities that are involved in them?
So you're optimistic about the UN?
Well, why not? I think it's
because there's no indication. I know when you're looking at financial advice, past performance is no indication of future performance. But with the UN, I reckon it is.
But you can get to a point of just saying, oh, it's too hard and it's defunct
hopeless.
And it's these sorts of things. Whereas I think it's a practical optimism, I suppose. So someone like Cristina Figueres was able, through the Paris Agreement, to reinvent the way that the climate conference was happening. So my belief is that if you can get some good people in, you can use those imperfect systems to get better outcomes. And if we don't have time to reform them, that's what we've got to do.
So in the minute or so we've got left, what advice do you give to the Amanda McKenzies of the next generation who might be just starting out on a similar path to the one that you did?
I think the advice is to take risks. I think when I look back at my career, I think any time that I have a regret, it's where I was less bold than I perhaps could have been. And I think for young people, that when I look back at that sort of early phase of my career, I didn't know what was impossible. And I remember, we started the AYCC, and within a year we're meeting with the Prime Minister and, whatever, and just thought, oh, well, yeah, of course, he should meet with young people. And I think if I'd started my career in advocacy as a 40-year-old, I might have thought, that's really hard to do. So I think that's the advantage of youth, is being able to not know what you don't know, but to take risks and to speak truth to power. I think that's what I see the young advocates at the moment, all the school strikers, they do an amazing job at that.
Amanda, it's been wonderful. Could you all thank Amanda McKenzie, please?
Thank you.
CEO and one of the co-founders of the Climate Council and a Monash Law alumnus. And next week, Carly Warner, who's the boss of the Aboriginal Legal Service for New South Wales and the ACT, is going to be our guest in this series of In Conversation for Monash Law. So I hope you'll join us for that one as well. And I hope you've enjoyed this evening. And thank you very much for joining us, and good night. Thank you, Amanda.